Most people are dead long before they are buried. They wake up to the same alarm, drink the same coffee, and walk into the same cage they've spent years building for themselves. They call it a life, but in reality, it's just a slow, quiet surrender. I was one of them. I was a ghost in my own house, a man who had mastered the art of existing without ever actually living. My days were not mine. They belonged to my boss, my bills, and the endless, suffocating noise of a world that demands everything and gives back nothing. I felt like I was drowning in shallow water, watching the shore get further away every single day. And then I found the hour. It wasn't a miracle. It didn't fall from the sky. It was born out of a moment of absolute crushing exhaustion. I remember sitting in my car at 5:30 in the morning. The engine was off, the world was pitch black, and the silence was so heavy it felt like it was pressing against my chest. I didn't want to go inside. I didn't want to go to work. I just wanted everything to stop. In that darkness, a thought hit me like a physical blow. If I don't claim a piece of this life for myself, I am going to disappear. That was the birth of the sacred hour. The first day, I didn't know what to do. I just sat in the kitchen while the rest of the world was still dreaming. The house was cold. The silence felt uncomfortable, almost aggressive. When you've lived your whole life reacting to noise, silence feels like a threat. I wanted to pick up my phone. I wanted to scroll through the lives of strangers just to numb the emptiness I felt in my own. But I didn't. I sat there with a pen and a blank piece of paper. For the first 20 minutes, I wrote nothing. My mind was a chaotic mess of anxieties and to-do lists. But then, something shifted. I began to realize that for 24 hours a day, I was a servant. I served a company that didn't know my name. I served a bank that only cared about my interest. I served a social circle that only valued my utility. But this 1 hour, this was the only time in my entire existence where I wasn't a father, an employee, or a taxpayer. I was just a human being. I decided that this hour would be my temple. No phones, no emails, no distractions. I divided it into 3 parts, and I treated them like they were the last 3 breaths of a dying man. The first 20 minutes were for the body, not for vanity, not to look good in a mirror, but to feel alive. I moved. I pushed myself until my lungs burned and my heart hammered against my ribs. In that sweat, I felt the stagnation of years pouring out of me. I realized that my body had become a tomb for my potential. Every drop of sweat was a rebellion against the version of me that wanted to stay on the couch and wait for death. When you push your physical limits while the rest of the world is sleeping, you develop a secret. You know something they don't. You know that you are capable of enduring discomfort. The next 20 minutes were for the mind. I stopped reading the news, which is nothing but a map of things you cannot change. Instead, I read the thoughts of men and women who had suffered and triumphed centuries ago. I realized my problems weren't unique. My pain wasn't new. I began to feed my brain with high-octane fuel instead of the digital garbage I had been consuming for years. I felt my perspective shifting. The walls of my cage weren't getting smaller. I was getting bigger. The final 20 minutes, those were the hardest. Those were for the soul. I sat in total stillness. I looked at the parts of myself I had been running from. I looked at my failures, my regrets, and the deep, haunting fear that I was a disappointment. In the sacred hour, there is nowhere to hide. You can't drown out the truth with a television or a conversation. You are forced to look into the mirror of your own spirit. I cried more in those 20 minutes than I had in 20 years, but they weren't tears of weakness. They were the sound of a frozen heart finally beginning to melt. People started noticing the change before I did. They asked me what I was doing. Was I on a new diet? Did I get a promotion? They saw a fire in my eyes that hadn't been there since I was a boy. I looked at them and I realized they were still in the fog. They were still running the race that has no finish line. They were waiting for someday. They were waiting for the weekend or the vacation or the retirement that might never come. They were giving away the best years of their lives for the promise of a comfortable ending. I stopped waiting. The sacred hour changed my bank account, sure. It changed my career, absolutely. When you spend 60 minutes every morning building a titan, you don't go into a meeting and act like a servant. You speak with authority. You solve problems with a clarity that others simply don't possess because their brains are still cluttered with the morning news and the stress of the commute. But the real change was deeper. It was the realization that I am the architect of my own reality. We think we need $1 million to be free. We think we need a different house or a different partner. We are wrong. Freedom is not something you buy. Freedom is something you claim, and you claim it in the dark, in the quiet, when no one is watching and no one is there to clap for you. Months passed. The sacred hour became the anchor of my life. I went through storms. I lost friends. I faced financial hits that would have broken the old version of me. But the man who emerges from that hour at 6:30 a.m. is not the same man who went to bed the night before. He is armored. He is focused. He is dangerous to the status quo. One morning, about a year into this journey, I looked out the window as the sun began to bleed over the horizon. I saw my neighbor's light go on. I saw him walk to his car with his shoulders slumped, his head down, looking like a man heading to an execution. I felt a surge of pity, but also a terrifying realization. That was me. That was almost my entire story. I was one decision away from spending my whole life in that gray, lukewarm misery. The difference between a life of greatness and a life of regret is 60 minutes. It's the willingness to sacrifice sleep for soul. It's the courage to be alone with your thoughts when the rest of the world is hiding from theirs. You might think you don't have time. You'll say you're too busy, too tired, or that your life is too complicated. But let me ask you this. If your life was a sinking ship and you only had 1 hour to plug the hole before it went under, would you find the time then? Your life is that ship, and it is sinking, second by second, into the abyss of average. The clock is ticking. You can keep giving your best hours to people who don't love you and systems that don't value you. Or you can take 1 hour back. You can build a sanctuary in the middle of the chaos. You can become the person you were meant to be before the world told you who you had to be. It starts tomorrow, not when you feel like it, not when the conditions are perfect. It starts in the cold, in the dark, and in the silence. The sacred hour is waiting for you. The question is, are you brave enough to show up?